All right, it's Wednesday. It's Politically Motivated. I'm Christopher Heath.
I'm Lauren Melendez. Good morning.
We have got a full slate to talk about, and I know we try and stick mainly to Florida politics, but as we know so well, everything intersects with Florida sooner or later. And there was a special election, not in Florida.
Nope, in Texas.
Technically, this would have been, if I still lived where I grew up in South Lake, Texas, it would have been my district. This would have been my district. This was my representative. It is a Trump plus 17 district that a Democrat won by 14 points.
Huge.
30-point swing. Now, we bring that up because our governor, Ron DeSantis, had a tweet that went out and it said, special elections are quirky, not necessarily projectable for general election. That said, a swing of this magnitude is not something that can be dismissed. Republicans should be clear-eyed about the political environment heading into the midterms. If that's not a giant warning sign to the GOP from somebody who was as close to being their standard bearer as possible, I don't know what is.
So, little background here. You were just talking about how this is a ruby red district, right? I mean, it has been historically, I think for the better part of a century, at least 50 years, half of a century, it has been historically Republican. No Democrat has been able to touch this. And yes, in this special election, Taylor Rahman, I want to make sure I'm saying that right, was able to beat out Lee Wamgom's significant, I think it was some 13,000 votes. Another thing here too is that Lee had tons of money. This guy Taylor, we know he's a veteran, Air Force vet. Just sort of casually expressed some interest a while ago in running, got some help from another lawmaker, and boom. What I want to underscore in terms of why this is so major in terms of how it affects Florida is that we saw Taylor grassroots campaigning. It was Latino voters, it was working class, and it was moderate Republicans. So that I think that is a wake-up call for us here in Florida.
The electorate is always going to be partially reflective of what the last 6 months, last year was, and the incumbent party tends to always take it on the chin in off-year elections, in midterm cycles, and so that all plays in. But it also sounds a bit of an alarm because we're seeing state after state do congressional mid-decade congressional redistricting, including Florida, which has said it is planning to, although it hasn't really started down the path yet. And I think this tweet from DeSantis, it says, to me, reading it, let's be careful about drawing these maps, because if we're looking at a environment that's D plus 10, D plus 11, you can't draw safe enough districts.
So this is a big deal because if it were to happen, if they were to actually gain this, potentially increasing their current, I believe, 20-8 majority, think about the larger picture, controlling, Congress. GOP leaders predicting gains of 3 to 5 seats by redrawing these districts to favor them. Obviously, this is not something that is going over well with most Democrats. And there are, again, some moderate Republicans who have said, let's leave this alone. Like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, mid-decade redistricting usually only happens if there is a substantial event. A court order comes in. Florida did a mid-decade redistricting last decade, but it was because Republicans got caught juicing the maps, so to speak, having their own people submit maps under different names or different email addresses in violation of the Florida Constitution. Florida voters in the early part of this century amended the Florida Constitution with what we call the Fair Districts Amendment. And it says you cannot intentionally draw maps to favor one party or one incumbent. So the maps have to be fair. And Republicans were caught with their hand in the cookie jar in the 2010s, and the courts ordered new maps be redrawn. This is not what's happening here. This is very clearly you have Republicans nationwide looking out at the environment and saying, we need to just redraw all the maps in places where we can. And what that does is it then spurs Democrats in states where they control, trifecta. They have the House, they have both houses, and then also the governor's mansion to say, okay, well, if you're going to redraw, so are we. Well, it's a race to the bottom.
I think ultimately the win in Texas, I forget the name of the county. I think it's
Tarrant County.
Tarrant County, 40 minutes west of Dallas, just to give you some perspective. Democrats have momentum. That is the bottom line right now. 40
minutes west of Dallas. Look at you throwing shade at Fort Worth.
Sorry. Okay, I know. I had to pick the big guys.
I am a proud graduate of Tarrant County Community College and the University of North Texas.
Tarrant County Community College. We're going to do a poll later on to ask how many people have heard of that. When we think about redistricting, when we think about the control that the Republicans have right now, Democrats are like, look, we got to win. And as you mentioned, the larger scale in terms of what's happening nationally, the current climate everything going on with ICE, everything going on with the frustration, even down to the Epstein files, Republicans sort of taking one stance, Democrats taking another. I think, as you mentioned, Governor Ron DeSantis is very keen on this and is saying, we got to be careful if we want to continue holding the power.
When you redraw lines, and redrawing lines is, we normally do it after the census when we know where people have moved, how much population growth has happened. This isn't what's happening now. We're redrawing lines, and what a lot of states that are doing this are doing is they're looking back at the last election, 2024. But we're seeing that the electorate in 2026 may not look anything like the electorate in 2024. A lot of those independents may be breaking away. A lot of those other groups breaking away. And so all of a sudden, if you are a map drawer in one of these states that's looking to pick up Republican seats, you're looking out at it and saying, I can't draw a map that's going to diminish these other ones and then also create these Republican seats, Republican districts that are like R+3, because R+3 may not be safe in this current environment. And this is where I think you're going to wait and see, do Republicans in Florida move forward with congressional redistricting? Do they move forward with a mid-decade redistricting? And if so, how aggressive are they going to be? Because they'd love to change the map and pick up 5 more seats.
Right.
But boy, does that put a lot of GOP, incumbents in a very precarious position, because they may take that Republican district that might be right now R+11, and if you drop it down to like R+5, is R+5 safe?
Strong enough, exactly. Yeah. This is going to be interesting. I'm going to be watching for the pushback, because I think that's going to be very loud, and Democrats are not going to go down swinging, and just advocacy groups, they're not going to allow this to happen arbitrarily just because Republicans want a stronger foothold.
Well, and then in the backdrop of all of this is the court system here in Florida. There will be a challenge to this under the Fair Districts Amendment to the Florida Constitution, saying you cannot just redraw these maps to pick up Republican seats. Right. And now the VRA, as long as it still exists, the Voting Rights Act says you can't redraw them you can't draw maps to favor any one minority group, or you can't do racial gerrymandering. But the courts have held you can do political gerrymandering. And then you run into Florida, where Florida's Constitution says you can't do political gerrymandering. This will get challenged in the courts if it does move forward. But again, I go back to the tweet by DeSantis, and I say there are concerns among the GOP that they may have gone too far with drawing some of these maps, and they may be putting some of their reps in peril.
Right. With that,
on that wonderful note, property taxes.
Oh, yay. The gift that keeps on giving. We have gotten nowhere with this.
There's a couple bills meandering their way through the legislature. But no, if you're waiting around for the great DeSantis proposal for property taxes, it hasn't transpired yet. We've seen a couple little things here and there about, what are we going to do? How are we going to we'll wind it down, or we'll give a 10-year window. All of this would have to go before voters. But the point is that when I've talked to lawmakers about this, and I've talked to some people up in Tallahassee, one of the things one of them told me in a call last week was, he said, it's a much better talking point than it is policy.
Precisely, because we see no real fruit of the labor here.
In other words, it's a great thing to say on the stump. Yeah. It's a great thing to get voters excited, to get people talking and I'm going to cut your property taxes. But then when you actually look at the math and you actually look at how it would go, you have a lot of rural counties, a lot of Republican counties raising their hand and saying, whoa, this would be devastating. Yeah. So the impetus to move forward with it is just not as much there, which is probably why we've yet to see a real push.
No formal written proposal. I think that's what it comes down to. There is no pen to paper that explains to voters or to just anybody really how this is going to be done. What is the impact that it's going to have on our services? We know the property taxes fund the majority of them, and this is a very complex issue. You cannot just repeal property taxes and say go forth. You have to have a plan. He has not outlined that. There's political division. There's timing with all of this. There are so many layers that have to be acknowledged, and so the governor, I think, did come out and say, you guys are going to have something soon, sort of kicking the can down the road. But what does soon mean? And again, what is it going to look like?
Yeah, and we're about a third of the way through this legislative session, so about another 40 days left in the legislative session, and we don't have the proposal out there yet. Meanwhile, we still technically have congressional redistricting lingering out there.
Right.
What is the state's bandwidth for doing this? Because you're going to have to, if you do property tax reform, it's got to get on the ballot for voters. If you do congressional redistricting, there's some significant timelines you'll run into. Cord Bird, our Secretary of State's already moved back a couple of those filing deadlines. But eventually you have to have people file to run for office. We have to hold primaries.
Right.
All of that has to
When's
happen.
this?
And so
Just
you start
do we have a
pushing all this
calendar
down.
that somebody's running for the governor?
Eventually, it just you run out of time to do these things, and so I'm wondering again, getting back to what my friend told me up in Tallahassee. It's a great talking point.
Right.
People love it on the campaign trail. Policy wise, not as good.
And I just wanted to, I'm always the politics for dummies person because I like to just make it super easy to sort of digest the need for a constitutional amendment that you brought up. Why is that important? So people understand that you just can't eliminate property taxes, right? They, on a large scale, this requires, again, like I mentioned, amending the state constitution, needs 60% voter approval in a general election, just like in November 2026. Governor and lawmakers have to work on crafting a ballot measure, but a final agreed upon version, as we've been saying, has yet to come. So before we even get there, there's all of this stuff that we have to accomplish. We don't even know what he's doing behind closed doors. Even if he could say, hey, I'm having conversations with this person, or I worked on this draft, I'm having it edited. We have literally no information. And so at this point, I'm wondering if we're giving it more attention than it deserves, because it doesn't look like it's going to happen.
Yeah, and of course, if past is prologue, what will probably happen is we'll discuss that there's nothing happening, and then one day we'll get this email or a press release or a press conference announcing that the entire proposal is ready to go.
And then we'll
and
have
it's going to be
55 million pages to parse through.
All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about other ballot measures that did not make it on. In fact, none of the ballot measures made it onto the ballot, specifically marijuana. And then if we have a little bit of time at the end,
Don Lemon.
We'll talk about, the federal government arresting journalists for doing journalist things.
All right, welcome back to Politically Motivated. Lauren Melendez here alongside Christopher Heath. Let's talk marijuana and how I feel like hopefully that got somebody's attention. It just will not end up on the ballot at this point, it doesn't seem like. So a proposed constitutional amendment that would have legalized recreational marijuana for adults failed to qualify for the 2026 ballot. And there's been some back and forth between the party involved trying to push this, Smart and Safe Florida, and the state saying, nope, you just didn't do what you needed to do.
Yeah, the state requires you to get signatures. You got to get them from all across the state. You can't just go to like one area and get a whole bunch. You've got to get them from each congressional district. So you've got to go through all 28 congressional districts and get a certain number of signatures. And then the state adds those up and they verify them and they go in and they look and they're like, okay, did you actually sign this? Are you a registered voter? Do you live in that area? That kind of stuff. Most of the signature verification happens at the local election office, and then they submit that to the state. And the state basically says, listen, you had to have 880,000 valid signatures. You only ended up with 783,000. That's 100,000 short. You're not going to get on the ballot. Safe and Smart Florida is like, whoa. We submitted 1.4 million. We think we've got enough. This thing is not going away, despite the fact that our Attorney General, James Upmeyer, seems to basically say it's a dead letter at this point.
Right. I mean, what's interesting, too, is that Safe and Smart Florida is blaming the county. I shouldn't say blaming the county, but they're basically saying, you guys didn't finish counting. So they needed them to, they said they had, like you said, they had the numbers. 1.4 million is well over the threshold, but it doesn't matter because, again, the state said you didn't meet the threshold, you didn't get the target numbers, and we're not moving this forward. And we know that this is a larger issue, too, in terms of the state really tightening the purse strings when it comes to petitions. There have been a lot of, I want to say rampant fraud, but enough so that they have said, hey, we've got to go back and check these signatures. Some of this is not looking right. These are not legitimate. Where did you get these people's names, addresses, phone numbers? And so that's sort of the push for why we're seeing sort of the microscope when it comes to these legitimate signatures.
Well, in 2024, you saw the state going into elections offices and looking at signatures on the abortion amendment that was going to go onto the ballot and looking to verify that. So you've seen the state really using its power of the Attorney General's office to crack down on signatures. And you've also seen the legislature take various steps over the last several sessions to make it much, much harder for Floridians to amend the state constitution. Florida's one of the few states where you've got to have 60% voter approval to amend the constitution. Most states, you need just a simple majority. Florida requires 60%. They've tried in a couple of years to move that up to 66%. That's not passed. Right. Fun fact, it's probably only fun for me, the amendment to the Florida Constitution that raised the threshold to 60% passed with less than 60%.
Now that's irony. I mean, it's irony. I do think that's a fun fact because I don't know, how can that be?
It only needed 50 when it passed, and then it changed it to make it 60 going forward. But yeah, the state's taken a lot of steps to crack down on the citizen petition initiative. And this all goes back to one after another. Floridians have gone to the legislature and said, we want you to do this.
Right.
And the legislature's been like, no. And then citizens will say, okay, that's fine. We're going to put out a petition. We're going to amend the Constitution, and we're going to force you to do that, whether we're talking fair districts, which we mentioned earlier, or we're talking about class size amendments. We're talking recreational marijuana, one after the other after the other. Floridians have told the legislature, we want you to do something. Legislature's not done it. And Floridians have amended the Constitution. Lawmakers don't like being told what to do.
Exactly. Let's talk about some of the challenges. If you are somebody who is pretty politically in tuned or very aggressive when it comes to getting things on the ballot, and you're out there signing petitions and you're wondering, why is this so hard? There have been some drastic timelines. There have been fines. I mean, we've seen petitions have to be submitted to supervisors of elections within 10 days. It used to be 30. So that's a significant timeline shortage to get things done. Late submissions have penalties. We're talking $2,500 per petition form. So they have really put a lot of barriers in place to let citizens, like you said, amend the Constitution. Enhanced ID requirements. Voters have to provide their driver's license. They have to give the last four of their social. I don't just write that down. I'm not somebody who's careless about that information. So if you want to see something in the Constitution changed and you feel like you've got all these hurdles you have to cross, there's no wonder you're not seeing a lot of successful petitions.
And they've also made it harder to finance this.
Right.
Because it's no secret that the medical marijuana petition was backed by Orlando Attorney John Morgan. Both times it ended up on the ballot. He was the major person behind it, both financially, and also he was out in front of it to the point where he now refers to himself as a pot daddy. But but they've cracked down on kind of that one person with a lot of money being able to come in and make this happen by, because it costs money.
It does.
To do petition drives. It costs money to send people to go stand out in front of a Target
Canvas
or
and go
a
door to
Publix,
door, right?
And be like, hey, would you mind signing this for this? So the state has taken a lot of steps to make it significantly harder. I'm not really surprised that. And by the way, not just marijuana didn't pass. None of the initiatives that were floated out there, registered with the Secretary of State's office, made it onto the ballot. So I'm not really surprised because they have made it so much harder. But we'll see. Listen, if Safe and Smart can prove its case and can say, you stopped counting, we had valid petitions that you should have counted, maybe they end up on the ballot. Even then, I don't know if Floridians pass it.
Just about to ask, what is the likelihood of that happening, right? Because they claim that they have these numbers. At what point does the county say, look, we're not touching this again?
Yeah, I think you're going to need a judge to issue some sort of injunction to send them to go in and say, okay, each of the Florida's 67 counties needs to keep counting these. Any that were submitted up to the deadline must be processed. Save for that, I don't know. And then, of course, this all belies the point that if it does end up on the ballot, does 60% of Florida vote for recreational marijuana?
Right.
I mean, it took 2 tries for medical marijuana to pass. I don't know that recreational can hit 60%. You never know.
Yeah.
All right.
Remains to be seen.
All right. We are going to wrap up with, I put this one in there because, as you and I have both been in this industry for a long time, and to see a journalist get arrested, and you say what you want about Don Lemon as, he doesn't work for CNN anymore, former CNN anchor, but covering an event. Now, the protesters who protested at the church, listen, you're disrupting a church service. Disrupting anything is not good. You can be trespassed. There are ordinances, there are laws out there to handle this. But to see the federal government, through Attorney General Pam Bondi, who actually had to issue the warrant for his arrest, go after him for covering an event, I think, we're not giving this nearly enough attention for what this means and what this says.
Right. I think people need to understand first and foremost that this is an objective issue, right? Journalists are covered by the First Amendment, freedom of the press, and you don't get that press if we feel threatened or nervous or anxious or just outright don't want to do our jobs because of the threat of potentially being arrested. Don Lemon was in Minnesota. This is a state, and in Minneapolis we've been talking about for literally the last 3 weeks here on our podcast. They have been in such turmoil. He was inside of a church. There were anti-ICE protesters interrupting service, as you mentioned. And there was suspicion, too, just to give you some context, that the leader of that church was actually some sort of ICE law enforcement officer. Regardless of it, he was there lawfully. He was allowed to be there. He and actually another independent journalist were arrested on the same day. And this is very concerning because there was no reason for him to be arrested. He was since later released. He appeared on late night TV. He issued a statement and he said, and I quote, "I will not be silenced." And he has been very vocal about this. He doesn't seem to be deterred. But what do you say to the journalists in Market 250, and Market 91 who wants to just do their job and bring you information, but now we're seeing people on a national scale be arrested?
It is concerning because Don Lemon will have plenty of ways to raise money. You mentioned he's already on late night TV. I'm sure if the legal defense fund has been started, I don't know if one has or has not, there will be money flowing into that. But yeah, what about your independent journalists, your small journalists, the ones who don't have the name ID? Are they? The chilling effect is pernicious, and I'm deeply concerned about where this goes. And the Cato Institute, I attached this in some of our show notes going into it. Cato put out a whole piece on this act that he was arrested under being very thin on constitutionality. He was arrested under the FACE Act, which stands for Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances. And if you're saying to yourself, well, hold on, this was at a church, not a clinic.
Right.
The whole thing was passed back during the Clinton administration in the 90s. It was kind of a compromise bill.
Right.
Basically what it did is it said that there's a right of access to abortion clinics, both for people protesting and for those seeking services. And this is the act that the current administration is now using to jail a journalist. Right. And you read through what Cato put out there, and it flags a whole host of problems. You mentioned the First Amendment. It flags another problem with the 10th Amendment because, this is not one of the enumerated rights that is given to the federal government. And then the 14th Amendment with due process. It just has a lot of problems in it, which is why you saw magistrates and judges, balk at issuing the arrest warrant, and the arrest warrant had to come from the Attorney General herself.
There has been coverage of it. I agree with you that the echo is not loud enough for me because the implication, or I should say the precedent that this sets, is very dangerous because Don Lemon does have the name recognition. They didn't just go arrest Joe Schmo from whatever city. And so to do that, I think they made a statement. Pam Bondi made a statement. The president made a statement. And this is also not the first time we've seen it. Back in 2020, during the George Floyd protests, we saw several journalists arrested. We saw Jeff Weiss, CNN correspondent, again, Omar Jimenez. This was 2020 when they were covering all the civil unrest there. And he was actually arrested on live TV. So, I mean, it's sort of history repeats itself. But I think now, given the political climate and all of the unrest and the frustration surrounding ICE enforcement, anti-ICE protests and pro-ICE protests, all of it, this has to be something that the federal government takes a stance on. I hope that they walk this back again, like they did with some of their enforcement in Democratic-led cities, only because there is a protected right for journalists to cover the news. And
listen, two things can be absolutely true at the same time. Protesting inside of a church service, disrupting somebody's, whether it's a church service or a meeting or whatever, it's their private property.
Right.
You are not allowed to go into Walmart or Target and hold a political rally. No, you can go into Walmart and Target and shop all you want, but you can't hold a political rally there. Somebody's having a church service or any kind of service whatsoever, you don't have a right to disrupt it and to hold a political rally. But this gets handled through trespassing. This gets handled through other methods. And that all belays the point of, okay, but if you're a journalist covering this and these people are going to go in there and trespass and try and get arrested and you go to cover it, you're covering it. You're not involved in it.
Right.
Now, it could come out down the road that he had some coordination with the group ahead of time and knew things and blah, blah, blah. If that's out there, then that's out there. And that's a different thing. You go then from being a journalist to being
part of the news.
Yeah, you go to being a part of it, being a protester yourself. Right. But if that line didn't get crossed and we're simply arresting him because we don't like him and we don't like what he was covering,
right?
There's a wonderful scene in Robert Bolt's A Man for All Seasons. And Sir Thomas More is having an argument with a witch hunter for the king. And the guy basically says, you'd break the law to capture the devil. And the guy says, break it. He says, I'd cut down every law I could to capture him. And Sir Thomas More says, yes, you would. And what would you do when the devil turns around to meet you? All the laws of England have been cut down. Where would you hide for protection? This is the problem. If we're willing to cut down all these laws to go after this one person, what happens when they're all flattened and there's no more laws and that devil turns around to meet you? Sooner or later, it gets turned back on you.
Right.
Yeah.
just as an aside, without cameras to record the multiple angles of the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis during ICE clashes with protesters, we would not have a lot of the discussions that we have. The same goes for the protest that involved Alex Preddy, the ICU nurse that was killed by ICE a couple weeks ago. So for the sake of just reiterating to folks that Don Lemon was covering the news, right, we would not be able to talk about the fact that there was a protest, that these people did go in and disrupt a private service and were on private property. I mean, they were not doing something that's lawful. Nobody is arguing that. But we wouldn't be able to sit here and have these conversations today without the coverage of that information and of that news. So that is why this is a big deal. That is why we hope you'll do your own independent research and read everybody's coverage of this, because we're not just saying this because we're journalists. We're saying it because it's the truth.
All right, on the radar for the next week, we have the legislature going to hit the halfway point soon. We will start to see contours of a budget, which is always fun stuff there. And we'll start to see some bills. We're getting to the point where if the bill's going to live, it'll live. If it's going to die, you'll get to know.
We'll know.
You get to know real quick that it hasn't been scheduled for a single committee. So maybe we'll do a grab bag of those next week, and hopefully not have other, this level of crushing morosity.
Also, happy partial government shutdown ending day. We forgot to mention that.
Yes, for all of you who celebrate the government remaining open, at least for a couple more weeks, as they hash out whether or not to continue to fund Homeland Security and what concessions can be made of that.
But we do have a funding bill that is in place right now. It'll fund the government for, like you said, a few more weeks, and then it'll be until next time.
Good times. All right. Well, thank you, as always, for sitting down with us, and thank you for watching. We'll be back here next Wednesday to do this all over again.
Politically Motivated. We hope you'll join us on News 6 Live every Wednesday at 8:30.